Going on to topic 5 now of chapter 1, adding real numbers. Now, pretty generally, this is easy stuff, but you need to know the rules. So in example 1, when we add 3 plus 2, as part of vocabulary, the 3 and the 2 are called add-ins, and the results would be the sum. So let's go on, and I'll raise this up a little bit here. And they're using a number line to illustrate this, that if we start at 0 and we go over 3 units, that brings us to 3. And then we add 2 more, it brings us to 5. So that's pretty straightforward. And they want us to use the number line to illustrate this as well. So let's do number 2. Here we have a -1, and we're adding a -1 to it. So again, we start at 0, -1 is right there, and we go 2 more, and we get to -3. So adding a -1 and a -2 gives us a -3. And if we're using the same number line, we start with a 2 here, and we do 3 more. That'll bring us to a -5. Now, I don't know if you're seeing what's going on here, is if this is a negative and a negative, well, we just add the 1 and the 2 and apply the negative sign, which will give us a -3. That is, if both signs are the same, we just add them up and use that sign. Okay. So here they're giving us a little word thing that if we lose money, whether it's in a stock market or wherever, we can think of it as a negative, and then we lose some more. Again, that's negative. Well, then our negative amount is larger. Okay. So adding two numbers with the same sign. Just add their absolute values and use the sign. If they're both positive, use positive. If they're both negative, use negative. So here we see some examples. They're both negative. So that's going to be a 10, and we apply the negative sign. Here they're both negative, so that's going to be 21, and we apply the negative sign. This will be a 12, and we apply the negative sign. And there's some extras. Now, here's where it gets a little bit tricky, but watch, they're using a number line to show you this. Here we're adding a -4 and a +6. So to start, we go from 0 to -4. And then from -4, we're going to go 6. And we end up at 2. And here we would go -3 and then 8. This would end up with a 5 here. Now, there is a way to do this as well, in which, what do? Well, we take the absolute values, which is a 3 and a 5, subtract the smaller absolute value from the larger, which gives us a 5, and then use the sign of the larger absolute value, which is positive. So, okay, they'll be showing us this as we go along too. And there's what I had just said. I'll let you read it. So let's do some examples. So if we subtract this, this is going to be a 4 here. And the larger absolute value is negative, so negative 4. Subtract these, we're going to get an 8. And the larger absolute value is a positive, so it's 8. Now here, the larger absolute value is this. When we subtract that, we get 0.3, and we use the sign of the larger absolute value. Now, if you're checking this using your calculator, just plug the signs in and the calculator takes care of it. But you want to know the principle behind it. So we'll do these practice ones too, since we have time. So this is going to be a 3 and a negative 3. This is going to be a 1 and a positive 1. And this is going to be a negative, that's the larger absolute value, and 0.2. Okay. So here's a sum. If we're adding a little summation, I should say. Same sign, different signs. Okay. And again, the proof of the pudding will be your practice and quiz bees. Did we finish already? Let's see here. No, example 6. Okay, good. Now for A, they're both negative. So we're going to end up with a negative 19. For B, one's negative, one's positive, so we're going to subtract the smaller absolute value from this, get 30, and we're going to use the sign of the larger absolute value. So here, this is larger, so it's going to be a negative, and when we subtract this, we get a 0.5. Now, these are both negative, so we're going to get a negative 8/10 that we will simplify to a negative 4/5. And here we're going to subtract that, and we're going to get a positive 6.7. Now for this one, we have to use our little system here. What's our common denominator? Remember, we can always go with a 40, just multiplying these two together. Now we have to get equivalent fractions, so 8 times what is 45, so a negative 15. Here we have to multiply this by 8. 5 times 8 is 40. 2 times 8 is 16. So we're going to end up here with 1 over 40, which I think they have right there. And there is some practice as well. Okay, example 7. Now here's a technique that you might use. Add your two negatives. That's going to give you a negative 15. And you have a plus 3. That will give you a negative 12. Now here in this bracket, we're going to end up with a negative 3. And here we're going to end up with, remember, this becomes a positive 4, so this is going to be a 2. So that is going to be a negative 1. Right there. Okay. So again, not too difficult. Now, as you look at this one, why is this wrong? Notice the negative sign. They got the difference, all right, of 17, but they had to apply the negative sign. Okay. And now for a nice word problem here. In Philadelphia, record extreme highs, this, decreasing this temperature by that. That was the low temperature. So a decrease in temperature is negative, so we're adding a 104 to a negative. That will end up with a -7. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. All right, another little concept here. Finding the opposite of a number. Well, the opposite of a number is what we would add to it to make it a 0. So if we had a 4, the opposite of 4 is a -4, because if we add them together, we'd end up with a 0. Now, a synonym for opposites is the additive inverse. It's what we add to a number to make it 0. We're going to use this when we solve equations in chapter 2. So find the opposites of these. See if I could raise it up a little bit. Yes. So generally speaking, it's just the opposite sign. So this will be a -5. This will be a +6, a -1/2, a +4.5. And here it's a positive, a negative, a negative, a positive of those. That is the opposite or additive inverse. Now here's where it gets a little bit tricky. Suppose we are saying, and sometimes this negative sign is read as the opposite of -3. What is the opposite of -3? Well, it's a +3. The negative of a negative is a positive. We say that two negatives make a positive. We use that in English. But in algebra, we're going to read this as the opposite of a -3. So what's the opposite of a -10? 10. What's the opposite of a -1/2? A +1/2. This will be a +2x. Now, this is interesting here. This comes out of the absolute sign as a 6, and it's going to be a -6. Why? Because the negative is applied after you take it out of the absolute value sign. Okay. And you'll have practice on that too. We use that a lot in our algebra course here. So adding opposites always result in a 0. So short lesson, 14 minutes.